The echo of gunshots still hung in the air as Morgan Redfield staggered back toward his chestnut mare, each step sending waves of searing pain through his side. The dusty streets of Copper Creek were empty now that the shootout was over. The cowardly Blackwell gang, having fled after Morgan, had put a bullet in their leader's shoulder. He'd won this round, but at a price that burned with each labored breath. Blood seeped through his cotton shirt, staining the blue fabric a dark crimson where the bullet had grazed his side and cracked a rib. Morgan gritted his teeth, clutching the saddle horn with white knuckles as he attempted to hoist himself up. The simple movement he'd performed thousands of times now seemed impossible, his body betraying him with each attempt. "What in heaven's name do you think you're doing?" The voice cut through his pain-hazed mind, clear and commanding. Morgan turned, still gripping the saddle to keep himself upright, and found himself staring into the fierce blue eyes of Bethany Ramirez. "Just mounting up, Miss Ramirez," he managed, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "Nothing to concern yourself with." Bethany's eyes narrowed as she approached, her skirts swishing in the dusty street, a medicine bag clutched in her hand. As the town's only doctor, she'd been tending to a patient when the shooting started, but clearly, she'd heard enough to know what had happened. "You're bleeding through your shirt, Mr. Redfield," she said, her tone brooking no argument as she stepped closer, examining the growing stain. "And by the way you're breathing, I'd say you've got at least one broken rib." Morgan attempted a smile. "Just a scratch." "I need to catch up to the Blackwells before they what? Before you bleed out in the saddle," Bethany interrupted, setting her bag down and reaching for his shirt without permission. Her hands were cool against his burning skin as she pulled the fabric aside to inspect the wound. "Just as I thought. You've got a broken rib, possibly two." "The Blackwells can wait," she finished for him, her voice softening slightly though her eyes remained determined. "They're likely headed to Willow Creek, and in your condition you wouldn't make it half that far." Morgan knew she was right, but the thought of letting those outlaws slip away after months of tracking them across 3 territories made his jaw clench. He tried once more to mount his horse, but the pain stole his breath entirely this time. Bethany watched him struggle for only a moment before stepping forward decisively. She took the reins from his hand and fixed him with a stare that would have made even the most hardened outlaw think twice. "Not while I'm here," she said firmly. "You're coming with me to my clinic, and that's the end of it. Miss Ramirez, I appreciate your concern, but it's Dr. Ramirez, as you well know," she corrected. "And this isn't a request, Marshal Redfield." The use of his title reminded Morgan of his responsibilities. He was the law in Copper Creek, appointed by the territorial governor himself in 1873 to bring order to this growing railroad town. For 3 years, he'd done just that, until the Blackwell gang had started terrorizing the region 6 months ago. "Those men have killed innocent people," Morgan argued, though his strength was fading fast. "They robbed the Willow Creek Bank last week, shot the teller." "And they'll face justice," Bethany assured him, looping her arm carefully around his waist to support him. "But not today, and certainly not at the cost of your life." Morgan wanted to argue further, but the world had begun to spin alarmingly, and he found himself leaning on the petite doctor more heavily than he'd intended. Despite her small stature, Bethany was surprisingly strong, bearing his weight as she guided him away from his horse and toward her clinic across the street. "The horses," he protested weakly. "Billy," Bethany called out, and a freckle-faced boy of about 12 appeared from the general store. "Take the marshal's horse to the livery, would you? Tell Mr. Peterson I'll settle up later." "Yes, madam." The boy hurried to take the reins, eyes wide as he looked at Morgan's bloodied shirt. "He'll be fine. Bethany assured the child with a confidence that Morgan wished he felt. Just needs some patching up. As they made their slow progress across the street, Morgan could feel the eyes of townsfolk watching from windows and doorways. 3 years in Copper Creek had earned him respect, but not everyone approved of a woman doctor, especially one as young and unmarried as Bethany Ramirez. She had arrived just a year ago, taking over the practice of old Doc Willis after his passing, and while her skills were undeniable, her reception had been mixed at best. The clinic was a modest building with a small waiting room and 2 examination rooms beyond. Bethany guided Morgan to the back room, helping him onto the examination table with a gentleness that belied her earlier firmness. "This shirt needs to come off," she said matter-of-factly, already reaching for scissors. "These are my good clothes," Morgan protested weakly. Bethany arched an eyebrow. "And this is your good life, Marshal. Only one you've got." She cut away the shirt with quick, precise movements, revealing the angry wound beneath. Morgan winced as the cool air hit his exposed skin, watching as Bethany's professional demeanor slipped for just a moment, concern flashing in her eyes. "The bullet grazed you here," she said, her finger hovering just above his skin. "But the impact fractured at least 1 rib. You're lucky an inch to the left and we'd be having a very different conversation." Morgan swallowed hard. "Wouldn't be having one at all, most likely." Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of mortality that people in their professions understood all too well. "Let me clean this," Bethany said, turning away to gather supplies. "It's going to hurt." "I figured as much." As she worked, Morgan studied her face, the concentration in her eyes, the slight furrow between her brows, the way she absently tucked a stray curl behind her ear. At 28, Bethany Ramirez was still a mystery to much of Copper Creek. She'd arrived with impeccable credentials and little personal history, taking up residence in the small apartment above her clinic and devoting herself entirely to her practice. Rumors swirled. Of course, that she was running from something or someone, that she'd lost a husband in the war, that she'd been rejected by a medical school in the East because of her gender. Morgan had never put much stock in gossip, but he couldn't deny his curiosity about the woman now tending to his wounds with such capable hands. "How bad is it really?" he asked, as she began wrapping his ribs with bandages. Bethany met his gaze directly. "Bad enough that if you'd gotten on that horse and ridden out, you might have punctured a lung when that rib fully broke. At best, you'd have passed out from the pain and fallen, possibly breaking your neck. At worst, you'd have bled internally and died slowly, alone on the trail." Morgan appreciated her honesty, even if the assessment was grim. "And now, you're going to rest here tonight where I can keep an eye on you. Tomorrow, if there's no sign of infection or internal bleeding, we can discuss what comes next." She tied off the bandage firmly. "But chasing after the Blackwell gang is not on the table for at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks?" Morgan's voice rose in disbelief. "Doc, I can't—" "You can and you will," Bethany interrupted, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Unless you want me to wire the governor and tell him his marshal is unfit for duty due to a self-inflicted aggravation of injuries. I'm sure he'd be interested to hear about your reckless pursuit of outlaws against medical advice." Morgan stared at her, caught between admiration and frustration. "You wouldn't. Try me." The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I take my oath seriously, Marshal, both the medical one and the one to this community." Before Morgan could respond, the bell over the clinic's front door jangled and a woman's panicked voice called out, "Dr. Ramirez." "Dr. Ramirez, it's Martha Jenkins, the baby's coming early." Bethany's head snapped up, the marshaling of her focus almost visible. "I'll be right there," she called, then turned back to Morgan. Don't move from this bed. I mean it, Morgan. I'll know if you try to leave. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and somehow that, more than her threats, made him nod in agreement. You have my word, he said quietly. Bethany studied him for a moment longer, as if assessing the value of a marshal's promise, then nodded once before gathering her birthing kit and hurrying from the room. Left alone, Morgan sank back against the pillows, the pain in his side a constant, throbbing reminder of his mortality. Outside, the sun was setting on Copper Creek, painting the dusty street gold. The Blackwell gang was getting further away with each passing moment, but for now, at least, Morgan found he couldn't summon the energy to care. For the first time in years, someone else was holding the reins, and despite himself, the marshal found a strange comfort in that thought as he drifted into an exhausted sleep. Morgan awoke to the soft sounds of movement and the pale light of early dawn filtering through the clinic's windows. For a moment, he was disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling above him swimming into focus as the events of the previous day came rushing back. The shootout, his injury, Bethany Ramirez's firm intervention. He shifted slightly and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his side. A soft groan escaped him before he could stifle it. Good, you're awake. Bethany's voice came from nearby, and Morgan turned his head to find her sitting at a small desk in the corner of the room, making notes in a ledger. She looked tired, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting she'd had little sleep, but her movements were precise as ever as she set down her pen and approached him. How long was I out? Morgan asked, his voice rough with sleep. Nearly 14 hours. Bethany placed a cool hand on his forehead, checking for fever with practiced efficiency. You needed it. How's the pain? Manageable, he lied, then amended at her skeptical look. Feels like I've been kicked by a mule if I'm being honest. That's to be expected. She helped him sit up slightly, adjusting pillows behind him. Martha Jenkins had a healthy baby boy, by the way. 7 pounds despite being 3 weeks early. Morgan nodded, genuinely pleased at the good news. The Jenkins will be relieved. They lost their first last year, didn't they? Something flickered in Bethany's eyes, surprise, perhaps, that he would know or remember such a detail. Yes, they did. This one's strong, though. Good lungs. A small smile touched her lips. I named him after his father. You named him. Martha was exhausted, and Mr. Jenkins was so overcome he couldn't speak properly. They asked me to choose. She shrugged, a hint of color touching her cheeks. It's not the first time it's happened. There was something so intimately human about this revelation that Morgan found himself seeing Bethany in a new light. Not just the efficient doctor who had bandaged his wounds, but a woman who held babies as they took their first breaths, who named them when their parents couldn't find the words. Before he could respond, the clinic's front door opened and heavy footsteps approached. Bethany straightened, her professional mask slipping back into place as Sheriff Miller appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. Morning, Doc. Marshal. The older man nodded to each of them. Heard you had some trouble yesterday, Redfield. Nothing I couldn't handle, Morgan replied automatically. Bethany made a soft sound that might have been disagreement, but busied herself with checking Morgan's bandages rather than commenting. Well, thought you'd want to know. Got a wire from Willow Creek this morning. Seems the Blackwell boys tried their luck at the saloon there last night. Ran into some Texas Rangers passing through. Morgan sat up straighter, ignoring the pain. And 2 of the gang dead, including Sam Blackwell himself. The other 3 captured and awaiting transport to the territorial prison. Miller looked genuinely pleased to deliver this news. Thought you'd rest easier knowing they won't be troubling us anymore. A complex mix of emotions washed over Morgan: relief that the threat was eliminated, frustration that it hadn't been by his hand after months of pursuit, and an unsettling realization that Bethany had been right. If he'd ridden out after them in his condition, he'd likely have missed them entirely or arrived too late to make any difference. "That's good news," he managed, aware of Bethany watching him closely. "Sure is. Town can breathe easier now." Miller replaced his hat. "I'll handle things until you're back on your feet, Marshal. Doc says it'll be a couple of weeks, at minimum," Bethany confirmed before Morgan could argue. "Well, rest up. Town needs you healthy." With a nod to them both, the sheriff departed, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. Morgan stared at his bandaged torso, processing the news. 6 months of pursuit, ended not by his efforts but by chance a random encounter with Texas Rangers in a saloon. "You're thinking too loud," Bethany observed, breaking into his thoughts. Morgan looked up at her. "Just wondering if all that tracking was for nothing." It wasn't. She sat on the edge of his bed, surprising him with the familiarity of the gesture. "You kept them moving, kept them from settling in here and doing worse damage. You protected Copper Creek." Her words were kind, but they didn't entirely ease the sense of incompletion he felt. Bethany seemed to read this in his face. "Not all victories look the way we expect them to," she added softly. "Sometimes success means staying alive to fight another day." There was something in her tone, a personal understanding of disappointment that made Morgan curious. "Sounds like the voice of experience." Bethany's expression shuddered slightly. "We all have our unfinished stories, Marshal." She stood briskly. "Now, since you're likely to be my guest for a few more days, I should change those bandages and then see about some breakfast. Unless you'd prefer to return to your own quarters." The abrupt change of subject wasn't lost on Morgan, but he respected her privacy enough not to push. "If it's all the same to you, I think I'd rather stay where the doctor is, at least for today." Something like relief crossed her features. "A wise decision. I'll be right back." As she left the room, Morgan settled back against the pillows, contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. For 3 years, his existence had been defined by his badge enforcing the law, protecting the town, pursuing outlaws. It was a solitary life by design, with little room for personal connections beyond the superficial friendships he maintained with townspeople like Sheriff Miller. Yet in less than a day, Bethany Ramirez had inserted herself into his carefully constructed routine, taking charge when he couldn't, making decisions he would normally resist. And strangest of all, he found he didn't mind as much as he should. Perhaps it was the pain medication she'd given him, or simply the relief of knowing the Blackwell gang was no longer a threat. But Morgan felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a willingness to let someone else lead, if only for a little while. The next few days established an unexpected routine. Bethany insisted Morgan remain in the clinic's back room, where she could monitor his recovery and ensure he didn't overexert himself. Despite his initial protests, he found himself adapting to the rhythm of life in the small clinic, the regular visits from patients, the quiet evenings when Bethany would update her medical records at the desk, while he read from one of the books she'd brought from her personal collection. On the 4th morning, Morgan awoke to find Bethany asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, a medical text open on her lap. He studied her in the soft morning light, the dark lashes against her cheeks, the loose curl that had escaped her usually tidy bun, the small scar at the edge of her jaw that he'd never noticed before. He must have stared too long, because suddenly her eyes opened, meeting his gaze directly. Neither of them spoke for a moment, caught in an unguarded exchange that felt strangely intimate. "You should have woken me," Bethany said finally, straightening and smoothing her skirts as if to restore her professional demeanor. "You needed the rest," Morgan replied simply. You've been working too hard. Bethany's lips quirked in a half-smile, says the man who tried to ride after outlaws with a broken rib. Fair point. He returned her smile, then sobered. But I mean it. You're here day and night, looking after me on top of your regular patients. When do you sleep? I sleep enough. She closed the book on her lap and stood, stretching subtly. Besides, you're improving quickly. Another day or two and you can return to your own quarters, provided you follow my instructions for rest. The prospect of returning to his Spartan room above the marshal's office should have been welcome, but Morgan found himself surprisingly reluctant. Trying to get rid of me already, Doc? Something flickered in Bethany's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or something more complex. Not at all. But I imagine you're eager to return to your duties, limited as they must be until you're fully healed. Before Morgan could respond, the clinic door opened, and the unmistakable voice of Amelia Sullivan, the mayor's wife and self-appointed arbiter of Copper Creek's social standards, rang through the waiting room. "Dr. Ramirez, are you in? I simply must speak with you about the most concerning rumors." Bethany's expression tightened almost imperceptibly before she smoothed it into professional neutrality. "Excuse me," she murmured to Morgan, then stepped into the waiting room, closing the door behind her. Despite the closed door, Morgan could hear the conversation clearly, Mrs. Sullivan making little effort to keep her voice down. "Dr. Ramirez, I feel it is my duty to inform you that there is talk about the propriety of your arrangement with Marshal Redfield. A single woman, housing an unmarried man for days on end, you must see how this appears. I see a doctor treating a patient with a serious injury." Bethany's voice was calm but firm. "Marshal Redfield suffered a broken rib that could have punctured his lung had he been moved unnecessarily." "Yes. Well, perhaps that was true initially, but surely by now he could be relocated to the hotel, where Mrs. Green could attend to his basic needs. You must consider your reputation, my dear." Morgan's jaw tightened at Mrs. Sullivan's condescending tone, and he found himself straining to hear Bethany's response. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Sullivan, but I became a doctor to save lives, not reputations. Marshal Redfield will remain under my care until I deem him medically fit to leave." Now, was there something else I could help you with today? A medical concern, perhaps? The icy politeness in Bethany's voice would have made Morgan smile under different circumstances. There was a moment of silence, then Mrs. Sullivan's voice again, clearly affronted. "Well, I see my guidance is not welcome. I shall pray for your good sense to return, doctor. Good day." The clinic door closed with more force than necessary, and a few moments later, Bethany reappeared in Morgan's room, her cheeks flushed with suppressed anger. "I apologize for the interruption," she said stiffly. "Nothing to apologize for." Morgan studied her face. "Though it sounds like I'm causing you trouble." Bethany waved a dismissive hand. "Amelia Sullivan would find trouble in a church picnic. Don't concern yourself." But Morgan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands weren't quite steady as she checked his bandages. "She's wrong, you know, about your reputation. Anyone in this town with half a brain knows you're the most honorable person here." Bethany's hand stilled for a moment, and when she looked up, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that caught Morgan off guard. "Thank you for saying so, but Mrs. Sullivan isn't entirely wrong about appearances. Small towns run on gossip, and gossip can damage a practice like mine where trust is essential." Morgan caught her hand impulsively. "Then I'll leave today. I'm well enough to make it across the street to my office." "Don't be ridiculous." Bethany withdrew her hand, but gently. "You're still at risk of complications if you overexert yourself. Besides," she added with a hint of her usual spirit, "I don't make medical decisions based on Amelia Sullivan's approval." Stubborn, Morgan observed with admiration. Determined, Bethany corrected, a small smile returning to her lips. There's a difference. Is there? Morgan raised an eyebrow. Seems like a matter of perspective. Most things are. Bethany adjusted his bandages one final time. Rest now. I have rounds to make, but I'll be back to check on you this afternoon. As she turned to leave, Morgan called after her, Bethany. She paused, looking back with slight surprise at his use of her given name. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. Something softened in her expression. You're welcome, Morgan. After she left, Morgan lay back, contemplating the complications of his extended stay. He hadn't considered how his presence might affect Bethany's standing in the community. Copper Creek had accepted a female doctor with reluctance. Adding rumors of impropriety could make her already challenging position untenable. Yet she had dismissed the risk without hesitation, putting his well-being above her reputation. The realization stirred something in him, admiration certainly, but also a deeper feeling he wasn't quite ready to examine. By afternoon, Morgan had made a decision. When Bethany returned from her rounds, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed in the clean clothes Sheriff Miller had brought from his quarters the previous day. What do you think you're doing? Bethany demanded, setting down her bag with more force than necessary. Being practical, Morgan replied, working to keep his breathing even despite the pain in his side. I'm well enough to walk across the street to my office. I can rest just as well there, and you can check on me daily without compromising your standing in the community. Bethany's eyes narrowed. This is about what Amelia Sullivan said. It's about being sensible, Morgan countered. You've done more than enough, Doc. Now it's my turn to make things easier for you. For a moment, he thought she might argue, but then something shifted in her expression. At least let me help you to your office, and I'll need to check those bandages again tonight. Morgan nodded, relieved she wasn't going to fight him on this. Deal. The walk across Copper Creek's main street was short but taxing. Morgan was breathless by the time they reached the marshal's office, the pain in his side sharp despite the slow pace. Bethany said nothing, but her arm around his waist was firm, supporting more of his weight than he wanted to admit needing. The office was dusty from disuse, but the small room above it where Morgan lived was neat enough, if Spartan. A bed, a chest of drawers, a small table with a single chair, and a bookshelf with a handful of volumes and personal items were the only furnishings. You live like a monk, Bethany observed as she helped him to the bed. Morgan shrugged, then winced at the movement. Never saw much point in accumulating things. Job like mine, you never know when you'll need to move on. Bethany's eyes scanned the room, lingering on the few personal effects: a silver pocket watch on the bedside table, a framed photograph of a woman who shared Morgan's jawline, a well-worn copy of the Iliad beside it. Your mother? She asked, nodding toward the photograph. Morgan nodded. She passed 5 years ago, influenza. I'm sorry. The words were simple but sincere. Bethany moved to the window, opening it to allow fresh air into the stuffy room. I lost mine when I was 16. Childbirth. Morgan absorbed this rare personal detail. Is that why you became a doctor? Bethany turned from the window, the afternoon sunlight creating a halo around her dark hair. Partly. There was a woman in our town, not a formal doctor but a midwife and healer. She tried to save my mother. A sad smile crossed her lips. She couldn't, but I saw how hard she fought, how much knowledge she had. I wanted that, to be able to fight for people even when it seemed hopeless. And your father, what did he think of your ambitions? A shadow crossed Bethany's face. He remarried quickly. His new wife had little use for his half-Mexican daughter with improper ambitions. I left home at 17, worked as a nurse's assistant during the war, saved every penny for medical training afterward. She shook her head as if clearing away old memories. But that's enough about me. Let's check those bandages before I leave you to rest. Morgan submitted to her examination, watching her face as she worked the professional concentration, the small furrow between her brows when something concerned her. He'd been the subject of her medical attention for days now, but this felt different somehow, more personal, now that he knew a little more about the path that had brought her to Copper Creek. "The wound is healing well," Bethany pronounced finally, rewrapping his ribs. "But you're still at risk of infection or tearing something if you overexert yourself. Promise me you'll rest." "Doctor's orders," Morgan agreed, catching her gaze. "I'll be a model patient." Somehow I doubt that. But she was smiling as she packed up her supplies. "I'll come by this evening to check on you again." "You don't have to, I do," she interrupted firmly. "That was our agreement, unless you'd prefer I drag you back to the clinic." Morgan raised his hands in surrender. "Evening it is." After Bethany left, the room felt strangely empty. Morgan had lived alone for years, and had always valued his solitude, but now the silence seemed hollow. He picked up his copy of the Iliad, trying to lose himself in the familiar tale of war and honor, but his thoughts kept drifting to Bethany, her hands steady as they bandaged his wounds, her eyes flashing when she stood up to Amelia Sullivan, the rare vulnerability when she spoke of her mother. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Morgan found himself thinking about a future beyond the next criminal to apprehend or the next town to protect. A dangerous line of thought for a man in his position, but one he couldn't quite shake as the afternoon shadows lengthened across his sparse room. True to her word, Bethany returned that evening, bringing with her a covered dish that filled the room with the mouth-watering aroma of chicken stew. "Mrs. Chen from the laundry sent this," she explained, setting the dish on his small table. "Apparently, you once helped her son when some boys were giving him trouble." Morgan recalled the incident, 3 drunk cowhands harassing the Chinese boy as he delivered clean laundry. He'd intervened, made it clear such behavior wouldn't be tolerated in Copper Creek. It had been a small thing, hardly worth remembering. "She didn't have to do that," he said, embarrassed by the gesture. "People take care of those who take care of them," Bethany replied simply, serving the stew into the single bowl Morgan owned. "It's how communities survive out here." There was wisdom in her words, a truth Morgan had observed but never articulated during his years as a lawman. The West was harsh and unforgiving. Those who survived did so not just through individual strength, but through networks of reciprocal care and obligation. "Speaking of community care," Bethany continued, handing him the bowl, "Mrs. Sullivan has apparently organized a committee to assist with your recovery. I suspect it's her way of ensuring propriety is maintained during your convalescence." Morgan nearly choked on his first spoonful of stew. "Please tell me you're joking." "I wish I were." Bethany's eyes danced with suppressed amusement. "Expect a parade of Copper Creek's finest ladies bringing casseroles and moral guidance starting tomorrow morning." "Lord help me," Morgan muttered, genuinely horrified at the prospect. "I'd rather face the Blackwell gang again." Bethany laughed then, a rich, uninhibited sound that transformed her face entirely. Morgan found himself staring, realizing he'd never heard her really laugh before. It was a sound he immediately wanted to hear again. "Well, if you're very lucky, you might develop a fever tonight that requires strict quarantine," she teased. "Though I wouldn't recommend that as a medical strategy." "What would you recommend, Doc?" Morgan asked, only half joking. "For surviving well-intentioned busybodies." "Patience and gratitude," Bethany answered pragmatically. "And perhaps a sudden interest in scripture readings, which Mrs. Sullivan is particularly fond of providing at 6. Morgan groaned, which made Bethany laugh again. The sound filled the small room, chasing away the loneliness that had settled there in her absence. For a moment, they were just a man and a woman sharing a joke, all questions of propriety and professional boundaries temporarily forgotten, but reality reasserted itself soon enough. Bethany checked his bandages with clinical efficiency, gave him strict instructions for the night, and prepared to leave. At the door, she hesitated, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Rest well, Morgan," she said softly. "I'll see you in the morning, possibly before Mrs. Sullivan's brigade arrives, if you're fortunate." After she left, Morgan lay in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of Copper Creek settling in for the night, piano music from the saloon down the street, the distant whinny of horses, occasional bursts of laughter from passers-by. Sounds that had been the backdrop to his life for 3 years without him really noticing them. Tonight, though, they seemed to speak of something he'd been missing: connection, community, belonging. Things a marshal on the frontier couldn't afford to cultivate too deeply, given the nature of the job and its dangers. Yet as he drifted toward sleep, it was Bethany's laugh that echoed in his mind, along with a dangerous wondering about what it might be like to hear that sound more often. As promised, Bethany arrived early the next morning, slipping into his room just as the town was beginning to stir. She looked tired but smiled when she found Morgan already awake, sitting up in bed reading his worn copy of the Iliad. "Preparing for battle?" she asked, nodding toward the book as she set her medical bag down. "Something like that," Morgan replied, marking his place. "How early do you think Mrs. Sullivan will begin her campaign of mercy? I passed her on my way here, consulting with the Reverend's wife." "I'd say you have less than an hour," Morgan grimaced. "Any chance that quarantine is still an option?" Bethany's lips twitched as she checked his bandages. "Afraid not, but your wound is healing nicely. Another week of rest and you can start light duties." "A week?" Morgan protested. "Doc, I can't stay idle that long. The town has survived the past 5 days without you and will manage a few more," Bethany interrupted firmly. "Sheriff Miller is perfectly capable of handling things in the meantime." Morgan knew she was right, but the enforced idleness chafed at him. He'd never been good at sitting still, even as a child. His mother used to say he was born with restless feet, always needing to be moving, exploring, doing. It was what had eventually led him west after the war, seeking purpose in the expanding frontier. "What am I supposed to do for a week?" he asked, not quite managing to keep the petulance from his voice. Bethany raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by his childlike complaint. "Raid, rest, receive visitors graciously, even when they bring questionable food and excessive sympathy." She finished rebandaging his side and stepped back. "Consider it an opportunity to experience life at a different pace." Before Morgan could formulate a suitable response, there was a knock at his door, followed immediately by its swinging open to reveal Mrs. Sullivan, flanked by 2 other ladies of the town's unofficial social committee, all carrying covered dishes and wearing expressions of determined charity. "Marshal Redfield, we've come to ensure you're properly cared for during your recovery," Mrs. Sullivan announced, sweeping into the room as if she owned it. Her gaze flickered to Bethany, registering her presence with a tight smile. "Dr. Ramirez, how fortunate you're here. We wouldn't want to interrupt any medical procedures." The subtle emphasis on the word medical was not lost on either of them. Bethany merely nodded, gathering her supplies with unruffled dignity. "I was just finishing my morning check," she said pleasantly. "Marshal Redfield is healing well but requires rest and minimal exertion. I'm sure he'll appreciate your assistance, as long as it doesn't overtax him." Morgan shot her a betrayed look, which she answered with the barest hint of a smile before turning to leave. "I'll return this evening," she said to Morgan, then nodded to the ladies and departed, leaving him to the tender mercies of Copper Creek's most formidable social arbiters. The day that followed was every bit as trying as Morgan had feared. Mrs. Sullivan and her rotating cast of helpers rearranged his room, forced various homemade remedies on him, despite his protests that Dr. Ramirez had already prescribed treatment, and filled his ears with town gossip thinly disguised as concern for his well-being. By late afternoon, Morgan was exhausted and increasingly irritable. When Mrs. Sullivan began not so subtly suggesting that a man in his position really ought to consider settling down with a suitable wife who could care for him in times of illness, he nearly lost what remained of his patience. "Mrs. Sullivan," he interrupted more sharply than he'd intended, "while I appreciate your concern, I believe I need to rest now. Doctor's orders." The older woman drew herself up, clearly affronted. "Of course, Marshal, we wouldn't want to contradict Dr. Ramirez's instructions." The way she said it made clear exactly what she thought of those instructions. "Perhaps tomorrow we can continue our discussion about suitable companions for a man in your position." After they finally departed, Morgan fell back against his pillows, feeling as though he'd survived a siege. The quiet of his room, which had seemed lonely the previous evening, now felt like blessed relief. He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, the room was bathed in the golden light of sunset, and Bethany was sitting in his single chair, reading a medical journal. "How long have you been there?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. Bethany looked up, setting aside her reading. "About half an hour. You seem to need the rest after your day of socializing." "Socializing," Morgan snorted. "Is that what they call it?" Felt more like an inquisition. "Mrs. Sullivan means well," Bethany said diplomatically, though her eyes betrayed her amusement. "She's from a different generation with different ideas about propriety and a woman's role." "She seems particularly concerned about your role," Morgan observed, remembering some of Mrs. Sullivan's less subtle comments about Bethany's unorthodox position in the community. Bethany's expression cooled slightly. "Yes, well, she's made her opinions on female doctors quite clear since I arrived. Fortunately, her influence isn't quite as universal as she believes." There was something in her tone, a carefully controlled defensiveness that made Morgan curious. "Has it been difficult being accepted here?" Bethany was silent for a moment, considering her answer. "Copper Creek has been more welcoming than some places I've been," she said finally. "There are always those who doubt a woman's ability to practice medicine, but many here have come to trust my skills, if not my gender." "And the fact that you're half Mexican?" Morgan asked quietly, remembering what she'd shared about her parentage. A flicker of surprise crossed Bethany's face, followed by a rueful smile. "You noticed. Most people don't or pretend not to. My mother was born in Sonora, but my father was as Boston Brahmin as they come. I inherited enough of his features to pass when necessary." The admission seemed to cost her something, a vulnerability Morgan hadn't seen before. "Is that why you came west?" "Less scrutiny about backgrounds out here." "Partly," Bethany acknowledged, "and partly because I wanted to practice where I was most needed. Eastern cities have plenty of doctors, even if most wouldn't accept a woman among their ranks. Out here, people are often grateful for any medical care, regardless of who provides it." Morgan understood that calculus all too well. The frontier demanded pragmatism above prejudice, at least when it came to survival. A doctor who could save your child's life or set a broken bone didn't have to conform to Eastern notions of propriety to earn gratitude. "Well, for what it's worth, I think Copper Creek is damn lucky to have you," he said with simple sincerity. Bethany looked momentarily startled by his directness, then smiled a real smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Morgan. That means a great deal coming from you." The moment stretched between them, something unspoken passing in the golden light of sunset. Then Bethany cleared her throat and stood, professional demeanor reasserting itself. "Let me check those bandages before I leave," she said, moving to his bedside. "And I brought you some proper dinner, not one of Mrs. Sullivan's mysterious casseroles." As she unwrapped his bandages, her fingers cool against his skin, Morgan found himself studying her face, the concentration in her eyes, the slight purse of her lips as she worked, the way a tendril of dark hair had escaped her practical bun to curl against her cheek. "The wound is healing well," Bethany pronounced, clearly satisfied with what she saw. "Another day or two and you won't need these bandages, though the rib will take longer to fully heal." "Does that mean I'll be rid of Mrs. Sullivan's nursing committee?" Morgan asked hopefully. Bethany laughed, that uninhibited sound that had captivated him before. "I doubt it. Once Mrs. Sullivan has adopted a cause, she rarely abandons it, but perhaps I can prescribe some official medical tasks that require solitude and concentration. You do that for me." Morgan's tone was teasing, but his gratitude was genuine. "Professional mercy," Bethany replied with mock seriousness. "I took an oath to alleviate suffering after all." Their eyes met, and they both smiled, conspirators in a small rebellion against Copper Creek's social conventions. For a moment, the roles they usually played, marshal and doctor, patient and physician, seemed to fall away, leaving just Morgan and Bethany, a man and a woman sharing a private joke in the fading light of day. It was a dangerous moment, one that threatened the careful boundaries both had maintained. Bethany seemed to realize it first, stepping back and busying herself with replacing items in her medical bag. "I should go," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Try to get some proper rest tonight, and actually eat the food I brought. You need your strength to heal properly." Morgan nodded, unwilling to break the fragile connection between them but recognizing the wisdom in her retreat. "I will, and Bethany," he called as she reached the door. She paused, looking back at him questioningly. "Thank you for everything." A small smile touched her lips. "You're welcome, Morgan. Good night." After she left, Morgan found himself staring at the door for longer than he could justify, replaying their conversation in his mind. There had been something in that moment, something that went beyond doctor and patient, beyond the professional relationship they'd maintained, something that felt dangerously like the beginning of more. The following week established a new routine. Each morning, either Sheriff Miller or one of the deputies would visit with updates on town business, followed by Mrs. Sullivan's committee of helpers bearing food and unsolicited advice. Morgan endured these visits with increasing patience, recognizing the genuine concern beneath the sometimes suffocating attention. But it was Bethany's visits, morning and evening, that became the anchors of his day. Their conversations gradually expanded beyond his medical condition, revealing shared interests and compatible worldviews despite their different backgrounds. Morgan found himself looking forward to her arrival with an anticipation that should have worried him, but somehow didn't. By the 10th day of his convalescence, Morgan was moving around his room with relative ease, the pain in his side reduced to a dull ache that flared only when he moved too quickly. When Bethany arrived for her evening visit, she found him fully dressed, standing by the window watching the street below. "Planning your escape?" she asked lightly, setting down her medical bag. Morgan turned, smiling at the sight of her. "Just getting reacquainted with the world outside these four walls. How was your day?" "Busy. 3 cases of influenza at the Petersons' farm, though thankfully mild ones. and Mrs. Abernathy finally had her baby a girl after 4 boys. She was so shocked she couldn't think of a name. "So you provided one," Morgan guessed, remembering their conversation about the Jenkins baby. Bethany shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Not this time. Mr. Abernathy had one ready, his mother's name, Elizabeth. It suits her." There was something wistful in her expression that caught Morgan's attention. "You like delivering babies, don't you, more than your other duties?" "Is it that obvious?" Bethany looked slightly embarrassed. "There's something miraculous about it. No matter how many times I witness a birth, it never loses its wonder." She shrugged, self-conscious. "Silly, I suppose, for a scientist to talk of miracles." "Not at all," Morgan said quietly. "Some things deserve wonder, science or no." Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of how much had changed in the short time since Morgan's injury. What had begun as a professional relationship had evolved into something neither had anticipated or sought, yet both were increasingly reluctant to deny. Bethany was the first to look away, moving to her usual task of checking his wound. "Let's see how you're healing." Morgan stood still as she unbuttoned his shirt just enough to access the bandages, her fingers working with professional efficiency that nonetheless sent his pulse racing. The routine examination was familiar by now, but the context had changed, charged with an awareness neither of them had acknowledged aloud. "The wound has closed nicely," Bethany pronounced, her voice slightly less steady than usual. "And the rib is healing well. I'd say you're ready to return to light duties tomorrow if you wish." "Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Ramirez?" Morgan asked, his voice low. Bethany looked up, her hand still resting lightly against the bandage on his side. "It is. Though I'd recommend continued rest in the evenings and no strenuous activities for another week at least." "Define strenuous," Morgan said, not quite teasing. A flush colored Bethany's cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "No chasing outlaws, no breaking up bar fights, no long rides." She stepped back, creating necessary distance between them. "Desk work only for now, Marshal." Morgan nodded, accepting her professional assessment even as he registered the personal retreat. "I'll behave. Sheriff Miller will be relieved to hand back the paperwork at least." "I'm sure he will." Bethany gathered her things, movements slightly hurried now. "I should go. I have a patient waiting." It was an excuse and they both knew it, but Morgan let her have it. "Of course. Thank you for stopping by." At the door, Bethany paused, turning back to him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Since you're returning to duty, I suppose our regular appointments will no longer be necessary." The statement was professional, logical, but there was a question in it, or perhaps Morgan simply wanted to hear one. "I'd still like to see you," he said before he could think better of it. "Not as your patient, but—" He trailed off, uncertain how to define what he was proposing. Bethany studied him, caution and something warmer battling in her eyes. "That would be complicated, Morgan, for both of us. Because of the town gossips, partly." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "And partly because our positions here require a certain distance from personal entanglements. You of all people understand that." She was right, of course. A marshal and a doctor in a frontier town like Copper Creek needed to maintain objectivity, to serve the community without the complication of personal feelings clouding their judgment. It was a principle Morgan had lived by since taking the badge, and yet, "What if I'm tired of distance?" he asked quietly. "What if these past 2 weeks have shown me there might be something worth complicating my life for?" The words hung between them, too honest to be taken back, too direct to be misunderstood. Bethany's expression softened, vulnerability replacing professional detachment. "Morgan," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. A sharp knock at the door cut her off. Sheriff Miller's voice called through, "Marshal, you decent? Got an urgent matter needs your attention." The spell broken, Bethany stepped back, professional mask sliding back into place. "Your duty calls," she said softly and opened the door. Sheriff Miller looked between them, clearly registering the tension in the room but professional enough not to comment. "Doc," he nodded to Bethany, then turned to Morgan. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's trouble at the Double B Ranch. Boundary dispute with the Hendersons turned ugly." "No shooting yet, but it's headed that way." Morgan straightened, Marshall's instincts kicking in despite his physical limitations. "I'll be right there." Miller nodded and retreated, leaving Morgan and Bethany alone once more. The moment that had passed between them seemed both immediate and distant now, overtaken by the reality of their responsibilities. "You shouldn't ride yet," Bethany said, doctor's concern replacing whatever personal sentiment she might have expressed. "Your rib—" "I know," Morgan interrupted gently. "I'll take the wagon, and I'll be careful, I promise." Bethany nodded, accepting his compromise. "See that you are. I didn't put all this work into patching you up just to have you undo it on your first day back." The light attempt at their usual banter fell slightly flat, overshadowed by what remained unspoken between them. Morgan wanted to return to that moment of honesty, to hear what Bethany had been about to say, but the urgency of the situation at the Double B wouldn't wait. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "Yes," Bethany agreed, stepping aside. "Be safe, Morgan." As he gathered his badge and gun belt, Morgan felt the weight of duty settling back onto his shoulders, a familiar burden, but one that seemed heavier now that he'd glimpsed an alternative. He paused at the door, looking back at Bethany standing in the center of his sparse room. "We'll finish that conversation," he promised, "when I get back." A small smile touched her lips, cautious but real. "I'll hold you to that, Marshal." The boundary dispute at the Double B took the better part of 2 days to resolve, requiring Morgan to camp overnight with the feuding ranchers to ensure the tentative peace held. By the time he returned to Copper Creek, he was exhausted, his side aching from the exertion despite his best efforts to follow Bethany's medical advice. The town was quiet in the late afternoon sun as Morgan drove the wagon down the main street. He nodded to townspeople who called greetings, noting with some amusement how many made a point of asking after his health. News traveled fast in Copper Creek, and his injury along with Bethany's care had clearly been a favorite topic of discussion. As he passed the clinic, Morgan glanced up automatically, hoping for a glimpse of Bethany. The building looked quiet, no patients waiting on the small porch. For a moment, he considered stopping, following through on his promise to continue their interrupted conversation, but exhaustion and the dirt of the trail made him reconsider. Better to clean up first, collect his thoughts, approach her when he could do so properly. Back in his quarters above the marshal's office, Morgan shed his dusty clothes and washed away the grime of the trail, wincing as he readdressed the wound on his side. Bethany would scold him for overdoing it, he knew, but the situation had demanded his presence. Some problems couldn't be solved by deputies, no matter how capable. He was just pulling on a clean shirt when a knock sounded at his door. "Come in," he called, expecting Sheriff Miller with a report. Instead, Bethany stood in the doorway, medical bag in hand, expression unreadable. "I heard you were back," she said simply. Morgan stared at her for a moment, caught off guard by her appearance when he'd been thinking of seeking her out. "Word travels fast," he managed finally. "It's Copper Creek," Bethany replied with a small smile. "Gossip moves faster than telegrams." She hesitated, then added, "I thought I should check your wound, make sure you didn't undo all my good work." It was a professional reason for her visit, a safe explanation that either of them could claim if questioned, but Morgan sensed there was more to it. "I'd appreciate that," he said, gesturing for her to enter. Bethany stepped inside, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. She set her bag on the table but made no move to open it, instead standing in the center of the room, watching him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "Are you in pain?" she asked, her doctor's eye assessing his slightly stiff movements. "Some," Morgan admitted. "Nothing unmanageable. You shouldn't have gone," Bethany said, a hint of accusation in her tone. "It was too soon. It couldn't be helped." Morgan held her gaze steadily. "You know that as well as I do. Some duties can't wait for perfect healing." Something flickered in Bethany's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or resignation. She knew the weight of responsibility as well as he did, the way it shaped choices and limited options. "Let me see," she said finally, all professional efficiency once more. Morgan unbuttoned his shirt, letting it fall open to reveal the bandage on his side. Bethany approached, her hands cool and steady as she unwrapped the dressing to inspect the healing wound beneath. "You're lucky," she pronounced after a careful examination. "No tearing, though there's some inflammation from overexertion. You need to rest properly tonight." "I will," Morgan promised. "The situation's resolved for now." Bethany nodded, rewrapping the bandage with practiced movements. When she finished, she didn't step back immediately, her hand lingering just above the dressing, not quite touching him. "Before you left," she said quietly, "you said something about being tired of distance." Morgan's breath caught. He hadn't expected her to be the one to broach the subject, to return to that moment of vulnerability they'd shared before Sheriff Miller's interruption. "I meant it," he said simply. Bethany looked up at him then, her professional mask slipping to reveal the woman beneath, uncertain, hopeful, afraid. "It would complicate things, for both of us." "Yes," Morgan agreed, reaching out slowly to brush a strand of hair from her face, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wished. "But maybe some complications are worth it." Bethany didn't pull away from his touch. If anything, she leaned into it slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "The town would talk. The town already talks." A small smile curved her lips. "That's true." She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "When I came to Copper Creek, I promised myself I wouldn't get entangled. That I would focus on building my practice, on proving myself as a doctor first and foremost. And now," Morgan asked softly, "now I find myself wondering if there's room for more than one priority in a life." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet room it carried clearly. "If perhaps I've been too rigid in my plans." Morgan's hand moved from her hair to cup her cheek gently. "I've never been much for planning," he admitted. "The job doesn't allow for it, but these past weeks have made me think about what might come after the badge or alongside it." Bethany's eyes searched his, looking for something Morgan hoped she would find. "And what did you see?" In these thoughts about the future, it was Morgan's turn to take a deep breath. He'd faced down armed outlaws with less trepidation than he felt in this moment of honesty. "I saw you," he said simply. "Not just the doctor who patched me up, but the woman who laughed in my room at sunset, who named babies when their parents couldn't find the words, who stood up to Amelia Sullivan without flinching." A blush colored Bethany's cheeks, but she didn't look away. "That sounds dangerously like sentiment, Marshal Redfield." "It is," Morgan acknowledged with a small smile. "Does that concern you, Dr. Ramirez?" "It should," Bethany replied, her own smile growing. "But I find it doesn't, not as much as it once would have." The air between them seemed charged with possibility, with words still unspoken but increasingly unnecessary. Morgan's thumb traced the curve of Bethany's cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin. "I'd very much like to kiss you," he said quietly. If that wouldn't be too forward. Bethany's laugh was soft, just a breath of sound. I think we're well past concerns of forwardness, don't you? And then she was rising on her toes, closing the distance between them before Morgan could move. Her lips met his with a gentleness that belied the strength he knew she possessed. A tentative question rather than a bold statement. Morgan answered with equal care, mindful of the newness of this territory for both of them. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but it carried a promise of more a beginning rather than an end. When they parted, Bethany's eyes were bright with an emotion Morgan hadn't seen in them before. "Well," she said, a slight tremor in her voice, "that certainly complicates things." Morgan couldn't help but laugh, the joy of the moment overwhelming the concerns that still hovered at the edges of his mind. The town's reaction, the potential impact on their respective positions, the uncertainty of a future that had seemed so clear just weeks ago. "Worth it," he said, and kissed her again, more firmly this time. Bethany responded in kind, her hand coming to rest against his chest, careful of his injury even in this moment of abandon. The thought made Morgan smile against her lips, ever the doctor, even now. When they finally separated, the room felt different, somehow warmer, fuller, as if the sparse quarters had suddenly expanded to accommodate this new reality between them. "What now?" Bethany asked softly, voicing the practical question that hung in the air. Morgan considered, knowing they both needed to proceed with care. Copper Creek might eventually accept a relationship between the marshal and the doctor, but sudden scandal could undermine Bethany's hard-won position in the community, and that was the last thing he wanted. "Now," he said slowly, "I think we take our time, get to know each other properly beyond patient and doctor. Maybe start with dinner," he paused, then added with a smile, "somewhere other than my sick room or your clinic." Bethany's answering smile was radiant. "I'd like that, though I suspect Mrs. Sullivan will have opinions about such an arrangement." "Mrs. Sullivan has opinions about everything," Morgan pointed out wryly, "but she'll have to adapt, as will the rest of the town." "You sound very certain," Bethany observed, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely displeased by his confidence. "About this?" Morgan's fingers intertwined with hers, a small gesture that felt monumental in its significance. "Yes, about us. Absolutely." The word "us" hung in the air between them, new and fragile but undeniably real. Bethany squeezed his hand, her smile softening into something more serious, more vulnerable. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "I have patients waiting and you need to rest." Morgan nodded, understanding the practical necessity even as he wished for more time in this moment they'd created. "Dinner tomorrow. I could pick you up at the clinic after your last patient." "I'd like that," Bethany said, gathering her medical bag. At the door, she paused, looking back at him with a mixture of wonder and determination. "This won't be easy, you know." "The best things rarely are," Morgan replied simply, "but I think we're both stubborn enough to make it work, don't you?" Bethany laughed, that uninhibited sound that had first captured his attention. "Determined," she corrected, echoing their earlier conversation. "There's a difference." "So you keep telling me," Morgan said with a smile. "I look forward to learning all the differences, Bethany Ramirez." With one last smile, she was gone, leaving Morgan alone with thoughts that spun like stars across the night sky, bright, hopeful, and infinite in their possibilities. News of Morgan and Bethany's dinner spread through Copper Creek with predictable speed. They had chosen the town's only proper restaurant, a small establishment attached to the hotel that served surprisingly good food for a frontier town. The public nature of their outing was deliberate, a statement of intent without words, a declaration that whatever was growing between them was nothing to be hidden or ashamed of. Reactions varied widely. Some, like Sheriff Miller, offered quiet approval in the form of knowing smiles or simple nods. Others, particularly Mrs. Sullivan's social circle, expressed their disapproval through tight lips and pointed whispers behind fans and handkerchiefs. Most of the town seemed simply curious, watching the development of this unexpected relationship with the avid interest small communities reserve for any novel distraction. For Morgan and Bethany themselves, the weeks that followed were a careful dance of public propriety and private connection. They maintained professional distances during daylight hours, the marshal and the doctor, each attending to their respective duties with the same dedication as before. But evenings increasingly found them together, sometimes at the restaurant, sometimes walking along the creek that gave the town its name, sometimes simply sitting on the porch of Bethany's clinic after hours, talking until the stars emerged above them. It was during one such evening, nearly a month after their first kiss, that Morgan finally asked the question that had been on his mind since the beginning. "Why did you really come to Copper Creek?" He asked as they sat side by side on the clinic's porch swing, the spring night cool enough to justify sitting close, their shoulders touching comfortably. Bethany was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the quiet street before them. "I told you part of it before," she said finally. "I wanted to practice where I was needed most. But there's more," Morgan prompted gently, knowing her well enough now to recognize when she was editing her truth. A small smile touched Bethany's lips. "You've become too good at reading me, Marshall." "Occupational hazard," Morgan replied lightly, though his eyes remained serious. "You don't have to tell me if you'd rather not." Bethany shook her head. "No, I want to, it's just." She took a deep breath. "Before I came here, I was practicing in Santa Fe. I had established a small but growing practice there, one of very few female physicians in the territory. There was a prominent family, the Montgomerys. The father was a banker, very well respected. His son became ill typhoid fever." Morgan nodded, already sensing where this story was headed. Bethany's fingers twined with his as she continued. "The family's regular doctor was away, and I was called in his absence. Mr. Montgomery was displeased to find a woman doctor attending his son, but there was no one else available. I treated the boy for 3 days and nights, barely sleeping." Her voice grew softer, tinged with old pain. "He died on the 4th morning." "I'm sorry," Morgan said quietly, squeezing her hand. "It wasn't unexpected. Typhoid is often fatal, especially in children. But Mr. Montgomery, he couldn't accept it. He began spreading rumors that I had mistreated his son, that my feminine sensibilities had prevented me from taking necessary measures, that if a proper male doctor had been present, his son would have lived." Anger flared in Morgan's chest at the injustice, but he remained silent, letting Bethany tell her story at her own pace. The rumors spread quickly. Patients began canceling appointments. Even those who had trusted me for years began to doubt. The banker's influence was considerable. Bethany's free hand smoothed her skirts, a gesture Morgan had come to recognize as a sign of her attempting to maintain composure. "I could have stayed and fought the rumors, I suppose, but I was tired, Morgan. Tired of always having to prove myself, over and over, because of my gender or my heritage. So you left," Morgan finished for her, understanding completely. Bethany nodded. "I heard that Copper Creek needed a doctor after old Doc Willis passed. It seemed far enough from Santa Fe that the rumors wouldn't follow, small enough that they might accept a female physician out of necessity if nothing else." "And did you find what you were looking for here?" Morgan asked, studying her face in the fading light. A slow smile spread across Bethany's features, transforming the lingering sadness into something brighter. "I found more than I was looking for, I think. A community that, for all its faults and prejudices, has come to respect my skills. Friends who value me for who I am, not despite it. Her eyes met his, and something I wasn't looking for at all. Morgan raised their joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Funny how life works out that way. I came to Copper Creek looking for nothing more than a place to do my job, maybe make some small difference before moving on to the next town that needed a marshal. And now, Bethany asked, a hint of vulnerability in the question. Now I'm thinking Copper Creek might be home for longer than I'd planned, Morgan said simply. If certain inducements remain. The word home hung between them, weighted with meaning. Neither had used it before in their conversations about the future, always dancing around the permanence it implied. But it felt right now, sitting on this porch with Bethany's hand in his, the town settling into evening quiet around them. I'd like that, Bethany said softly. For Copper Creek to be home, for both of us. The admission was as close as they had come to speaking of a shared future, and Morgan felt its significance like a physical presence between them. He leaned in slowly, giving Bethany time to pull away if she wished, though they had shared many kisses in the weeks since their first. She met him halfway, her lips soft and yielding beneath his, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest where his heart beat steadily beneath her palm. The kiss deepened, no longer the careful exploration of their early encounters but something more certain, more knowing. When they finally broke apart, Morgan rested his forehead against hers, content in the moment and all it promised. I should go, he said reluctantly. Early patrol tomorrow. Bethany nodded, though her hand remained on his chest. I know. I have deliveries to prepare for the Hendersons' ranch. Their youngest is due any day now. Yet neither moved immediately, reluctant to end this moment of connection. Finally, Morgan stood, drawing Bethany up with him. I'll walk you upstairs, he offered, nodding toward her apartment above the clinic. At her door, they paused once more, the air between them charged with words still unspoken but increasingly understood. Morgan brushed a strand of hair from Bethany's face, marveling at how this simple gesture had become so familiar, so essential to his happiness. Good night, Bethany, he said softly. Good night, Morgan, she replied, rising on her toes to press one last kiss to his lips before slipping inside, leaving him to make his way back to his own quarters, his thoughts full of home and future and the woman who had unexpectedly become central to both. The seasons turned, spring warming into summer, and with them, Morgan and Bethany's relationship deepened into something the town of Copper Creek gradually came to accept as a fixed feature of their community. Even Mrs. Sullivan's opposition softened after Bethany saved her granddaughter's life when the child developed a dangerous fever during a visit. I suppose, the older woman had grudgingly admitted to Morgan afterward, that there are more important considerations than strict adherence to convention. Though, she added with a sniff, I still maintain that certain formalities should be observed for propriety's sake. Morgan had simply nodded, hiding his amusement at Mrs. Sullivan's transparent hints about marriage. It wasn't that he hadn't thought about making his relationship with Bethany official, quite the contrary. But he knew Bethany valued her independence, the professional standing she had worked so hard to establish. He wouldn't rush her, wouldn't pressure her into a decision that might undermine what she had built for herself in Copper Creek. So they continued as they were, their lives increasingly intertwined even as they maintained separate residences and professional identities. Morgan's broken rib had long since healed, though occasionally, in cold weather or after particularly strenuous activity, a twinge would remind him of the injury that had brought them together. It was during one such moment, a sharp pain catching him by surprise as he mounted his horse for patrol, that Morgan made a decision he had been contemplating for weeks. The pain passed quickly, but the memory it triggered of Bethany taking the reins from his hands, firmly declaring, "Not while I'm here," remained, crystallizing his thoughts into clarity. That evening, he arrived at Bethany's clinic just as she was finishing with her last patient, an elderly man with rheumatism who nodded respectfully to Morgan as he departed. Bethany looked up from her patient ledger, a warm smile spreading across her features at the sight of him. "You're early," she observed, setting aside her pen. "I thought you had evening rounds." "Delegated them to Deputy Hayes," Morgan replied, crossing the room to greet her properly with a brief kiss. "Thought we might take a ride together if you're not too tired." Curiosity flickered in Bethany's eyes, but she nodded. "Let me change into my riding clothes. Where are we going?" "It's a surprise," Morgan said with a smile. "But dress warmly, we might be out after sunset." 20 minutes later, they were riding side by side along the creek that gave the town its name, following it upstream into the rolling hills beyond the settled area. The late summer evening was perfect, warm but not hot, the setting sun painting the landscape in gold and amber, a light breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and pine. "Are you going to tell me where we're headed, or is the mystery part of the appeal?" Bethany asked as they crested a small rise, the town now hidden behind them. Morgan smiled, enjoying her curiosity. "Just a little further. There's something I want to show you." They rode on, the trail narrowing as it wound through a stand of cottonwoods that lined the creek. Beyond the trees, the land opened into a small, sheltered valley, a natural meadow carpeted with wildflowers, bordered by the creek on one side and gentle slopes on the others. Near the far edge stood a simple cabin, weathered but solid, with a small covered porch facing the meadow. Morgan reined in his horse, watching Bethany's face as she took in the scene. Her expression shifted from curiosity to surprise, then to a questioning look directed at him. "Whose place is this?" she asked. "I didn't know anyone lived out here." "No one does at present," Morgan replied, dismounting and moving to help her down from her horse, though she rarely needed assistance. "It belonged to old Jim Harker, the prospector. When he struck silver over in Nevada last year, he decided to follow the strike and sell this place." Understanding began to dawn in Bethany's eyes as Morgan led her toward the cabin, the horses left to graze contentedly in the meadow. "And who owns it now?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Morgan stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, turning to face her fully. "I do, as of yesterday." Bethany's eyes widened. "You bought a cabin, Morgan. I didn't even know you were looking for property." "I wasn't, not exactly," he admitted. "But Jim wrote to me a month ago, offering me first refusal on the place. Said he remembered how I'd always admired it when I'd ride out this way on patrol." Morgan looked around at the peaceful setting, then back to Bethany. "I've been thinking about it ever since, about what it could mean." The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken but increasingly clear. Bethany's gaze moved from Morgan to the cabin and back, a mixture of emotions playing across her features. "It's a lovely spot," she said finally, her voice careful, "but it's a fair ride from town." "Not the most convenient location for a marshal," Morgan nodded, acknowledging the practical concern. "About that," he said, taking her hands in his. "I've been considering my options lately. The territory's growing, changing. Copper Creek with it, the railroads bringing more people, more commerce. And more need for law enforcement," Bethany pointed out. "Yes," Morgan agreed, "but also more opportunity for a man with experience in keeping the peace. The governor's establishing a circuit court in the county seat, needs someone to serve as a judge." Someone who understands frontier justice but respects the law. Surprise flashed across Bethany's face. Judge Redfield, that has a certain ring to it. It would mean less daily danger, Morgan continued, watching her reaction carefully. More regular hours, a more settled position. Bethany's expression softened as she began to understand what he was really saying. And is that what you want, to be settled? I want a home, Morgan said simply. One that's more than 4 walls above an office, one that could be. He hesitated, then pressed on. One that could be ours if you wanted it to be. Bethany's breath caught, her hands tightening around his. Morgan, I'm asking if you could see a future here, Morgan clarified, not wanting to rush her or press for more than she was ready to give. Not just in Copper Creek, but here in this place. With me. Emotion welled in Bethany's eyes, a complex mixture of hope and hesitation. What about my practice? The clinic? It would be yours still, always. I'd never ask you to give that up. Morgan smiled, reaching up to touch her cheek gently. But it's not such a long ride from here to town. And if the judge's wife happened to be a doctor who kept her own practice and her own name professionally, well, that would be between them, wouldn't it? The word wife hung in the air between them, not quite a proposal but an unmistakable indication of his intentions. Bethany's eyes searched his, looking for reassurance he hoped she would find. You'd really be all right with that? A wife who maintains her own practice, her own identity. Bethany, Morgan said softly, I fell in love with you as you are determined, independent, compassionate, brilliant. Why would I want to change any of that? It was the first time he had spoken the word love aloud, though they had demonstrated it in countless ways over the months of their relationship. Bethany's eyes widened slightly, then softened into a warmth that took Morgan's breath away. You love me, she said, not quite a question but seeking confirmation nonetheless. With everything I am, Morgan replied simply. And I think you might love me too, though you've been careful not to say it. A smile bloomed across Bethany's face, radiant in the golden evening light. I do, she admitted, her voice clear and certain. I love you, Morgan Redfield, more than I ever thought possible. Joy surged through Morgan at her words even as she continued. But I need you to understand my work, my independence. They're not just preferences. They're essential to who I am. I can't be the kind of wife who Morgan silenced her with a gentle finger to her lips. I'm not asking you to be any kind of wife but your own. All I want is to build a life with you, Bethany, however that looks, whatever form it takes. The last of her hesitation melted away, replaced by a certainty that matched his own. Then yes, she said, her voice strong and clear. Yes, I can see a future here with you, our future. Morgan pulled her into his arms then, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't contain, the love, the relief, the promise of a future neither had imagined when she took the reins from his hands all those months ago. When they finally separated, breathless and laughing, Morgan gestured toward the cabin behind them. Would you like to see inside? It needs some work, but the bones are good. I would, Bethany said, then added with a teasing smile. Though I should warn you, I have very specific ideas about where a medical library should be situated in a home. Morgan laughed, taking her hand as they climbed the porch steps together. I wouldn't have it any other way, Dr. Ramirez. As they crossed the threshold into what would become their home, Morgan found himself reflecting on the strange turns of fate that had brought them to this moment: a bullet graze, a broken rib, a stubborn doctor who refused to let him ride when he should have been healing. What are you thinking? Bethany asked, noticing his thoughtful expression as they stood in the cabin's main room, dust motes dancing in the last rays of sunlight through the windows. I was just remembering the day we really met, when you took the reins from my hands and said, not while I'm here. Bethany's smile was soft with memory. "You were so stubborn, determined to ride off after those outlaws despite being barely able to stand. And you were equally determined to stop me," Morgan recalled, pulling her gently into his arms. "Best thing that ever happened to me, that broken rib." "Is that so?" Bethany raised an eyebrow, her arms sliding around his waist. "Perhaps I should have let you ride off after all, saved myself the trouble of falling in love with a stubborn lawman." "Too late now," Morgan murmured, bending to kiss her again. "You're stuck with me, Dr. Ramirez." "Happily so, Marshal Redfield," Bethany replied against his lips. "Happily so." Outside, the sun slipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the meadow. But inside the cabin, their cabin, a different kind of light was growing, warming the weathered walls with the promise of a future neither had sought but both had found in the most unexpected of circumstances. A future that had begun with a broken rib, a pair of steady hands, and the simple, determined words that had changed everything. "Not while I'm here."